The prologue to John is the most magnificent piece of literature in the entire New Testament, both in terms of how it's constructed and its high and soaring theology. It's just beautiful and incredibly rich. It speaks of this word coming, in Greek, logos. We get such words in English from logos, such as logic or logistics or psychology or sociology. For hundreds of years before John wrote this gospel, Greek philosophers believed in a logos. And they believed that this logos was the source of reason, truth, stability in the universe. If you had something to sort of hold on to and depend on in the universe, it was the logos. John, of course, here identifies the logos in that first verse as God. That would have surprised the Greek philosophers of several hundred years prior. For if you remember your Greek and Roman mythology, the Greek gods, the pagan gods of Greece and Rome, were anything but dependable. They were fickle, they were strange, they were always fighting amongst themselves, and they had petty jealousies playing out. The pagan gods of Greece and Rome were many things, but dependable was not one of them. And so Greek philosophy imagined this logos, this word that sort of kept the fickleness of the gods in check. That is what you could depend on and hold on to. It's what the logos is what kept the trains of creation running and on time. About 40 years before Jesus was born, a man named Philo was born in Alexandria, Egypt. He was a Jew. And he took this logos theology of Greek philosophy and moved it into Jewish theology and said, yes, we can recognize a logos in the Old Testament. Of course, the Old Testament is pretty firm on its monotheism, but the Old Testament also has these different emanations of God. God shows up in different ways. Sometimes it's just the Lord. Sometimes it's the angel of the Lord. Sometimes it's the Spirit of the Lord. Sometimes it's the glory of the Lord. And Jews would say, yes, it's all one God, but God is showing up differently in each of those emanations. And Philo said one of these emanations, one of these ways that God shows up, is the Logos. God, our God, is the one who is not fickle and strange and always has petty jealousies and is always fighting amongst himself or others, but God is the one that we can hold on to and depend, our rock and our salvation. John, then, John, the author of the Gospel of John, writing almost 100 years after Jesus' birth and some 70 years after his death and resurrection, takes it even one step further from Philo and says this word is Jesus. This word is God, the second person of the Trinity, this source of reason and truth, and to that, John adds light and life. We find in Jesus. And then towards the end, we find that life, world-changing verse, and the Word, this sort of concept, this thing that's out there in the ether, became flesh and lived among us. That word there for lived among us, it's a very weak translation. It literally means tabernacled among us or pitched a tent among us. If I said my mother was coming to live with us, you'd say, oh, okay. If I was saying she's pitching a tent in the front yard, you go, oh, that's a little different. John meant something different when he meant the Word was coming and pitching his tent with us. There's a majesty in John, but there is also a closeness and an intimacy. The majesty and the poetry and the high theology of the prologue to John is, in some way, interrupted by the second paragraph of the lesson. I did a adult forum on the prologue to John. I think it was almost exactly a year ago, and I think I managed to completely skirt the second passage, because the second passage isn't really about Jesus. It's about John the Baptist, not John the author of the gospel, but John the Baptist. And so all the words about the Word and light and life and all things coming to being in him sort of gets interrupted by, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. Again, very close. In the Gospel of John, John the Baptist, in this second paragraph, which sort of like stops the flow of the prologue, in John's Gospel, John the Baptist is never called John the Baptist. He is never referred to as the baptizer, as he is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For John, the evangelist, the author of the gospel, John's purpose for him wasn't captured in his dunking people in the Jordan River. For him, who John was the witness. He who testified to the light. It's fine to have this light and life and logos and that him who all things came into being, but unless you have someone that is pointing to this word, this life, this light, then it might go unnoticed. John's ministry was essential. In his generation, at his time, we needed somebody to point the way to Jesus. But just because John did it 2,000 years ago doesn't mean that that ministry isn't incredibly necessary. We still need witnesses to the word, to life, to light that was in this Jesus who became flesh and pitched his tent with us. We all woke up this morning and to news that Archbishop Desmond Tutu has died. And so I thought I would just say a few words about his way of being a witness and one who testified to the word and to life and to light. Most of you probably know I have a personal connection with Desmond Tutu. He was a professor of mine in seminary. I have a funny story, which I will share later if you want, about how I sort of credit him with me being a priest, letting me get through the process, but maybe later. Desmond Tutu, I mean, of course, it's the one thing that he is known world around, was a tireless advocate for justice. He was criticized in his time, of course, for being too political. People said, stop all this talking about apartheid and just talk about Jesus and salvation and leave the rest to us. But for Tutu, there is nothing less spiritual than the dignity of every human being, forged right in the first chapter of the first book of the Bible, that notion that every single one of us are children of God, created in God's image. Not some of us of one hue of skin, but not others. Not some people from some part of the globe, but not others. We are all one human family. We are all children of God. We are all indelibly marked with God's image, God's imprint on our lives. And to treat another human being as less than, for any reason, is a spiritual issue. And for a society to do that means that there is a deep spiritual rot at the center of it, which is what Tutu tirelessly and to great personal danger to himself and his family, preached every single day with his words and his actions. It's why he was the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. He was an advocate for justice, not just because he wanted to be political, but because he was a witness to this child who was born in Bethlehem. He testified to the life and light that was in him, Jesus. He was also a tireless advocate for forgiveness. It was after apartheid fell, his new raison d'etre was to compel people to forgive each other. He looked at his own country and he saw all of the various parties, those who were for apartheid and were propping it up, and those who were fighting against it. He saw atrocities committed across the spectrum. He said no one had their hands clean, and he fervently believed that South Africa would not be able to progress as a nation if they didn't somehow reconcile and forgive. And again, that wasn't just a nice idea that Desmond Tutu sort of made up out of his own head. He got it from Jesus. It was a way of witnessing to the ministry of Jesus, where forgiveness is at its core. I had him as a professor in seminary, but of course, as you can imagine, his classes were kind of popular. Everyone wanted to, so it was held in the one big theater-style classroom at the seminary. I think there were like 120 people in the class, so it wasn't exactly intimate. He came in with his retinue and gave his lecture, and then he left. But realizing that we missed out on intimacy, and I think wanting intimacy with his students, he then set up office hours with small groups of students to come and sit with him and be with him throughout the semester. And so I signed up for one of those and sat in a little circle in his office, and he just wanted to hear from us, and he asked us to sort of go around and say, look, what's on your mind? And so many of you know I had a very trying relationship with my father. It was certainly emotionally abusive at that time when I was in seminary. Things were not good. Things were firing up in that relationship a lot. And so I brought that up and I said, you know, Archbishop, I'm not sure what I do about forgiveness. I hear you talk about forgiveness every lecture, every sermon you give, but I'm not sure how to do that. And he told the story, and he didn't have to do this, but he told the story of his own childhood where his father was an abusive alcoholic who would go out at night, get incredibly drunk, come home and beat his mother, beat Desmond's mother. And the Archbishop said he was so angry that he would go to bed at night imagining, dreaming, fantasizing about getting a gun and killing his father. And as he's telling the story, I was blown away by the fact that here is the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize talking about wanting to kill his father. But then he said that after many years, that he was able to come to some, long after his father had died, come to some reconciliation, that he was able to forgive in his heart. His understanding of forgiveness is that it's not cheap, but that it is sometimes hard-earned and fought in our own hearts. But if we keep working at it, we can somehow get there. Again, that was one of the ways that he was a witness and testified to this child born in Bethlehem. He was also, and I'll finish with this, a tireless advocate for joy. So when he was at the seminary, he was suffering with cancer. I forget what kind. It'll come to me. But he was undergoing treatments, radiation. He had surgery. He was out. He'd be out for a week, and then he'd come back, and he'd be out for another week, and he would come back just not feeling well. As a seminary community, we had chapel services every Tuesday and Thursday, and even when he wasn't teaching, he would still find a way to come to those services to worship and pray with us, and he would come in with his cane and make his way in. You could tell just how uncomfortable prostate cancer, how uncomfortable he was. And hopefully, in a service of worship, there's at least one piece of music that's pretty good, right, Mike? You want at least one hymn to be a good one. You try. And there would be that one hymn that would be sort of a stirring one in the service. And Desmond Tutu would stand up and he would start dancing. A very traditional Anglo-Catholic archbishop. I mean, he liked the smells and the bells and the prostrations and the genuflections and the chanting and all that, but part of the African tradition is that you dance. And so he would get up and he would start dancing. And we, the rest of us, are all, singing out of our hymnals, very staid, as you can imagine, all of us sitting there, as you do. But what do you do when the Archbishop of South Africa stands after having prostate cancer surgery and he's dancing? You got to stand up and dance. And none of us were good at it, but we danced anyway. And as we danced, we would, of course, be looking at each other, feeling kind of silly. And then we would be laughing. This man, he was a short little man, short in stature, physically at least. Joy erupted in this room, not as a shtick, but as a witness to this child who was born in Bethlehem. We've seen John the Baptist's way of witnessing to Christ. We have seen as a world Archbishop Desmond Tutu's way of witnessing to Christ. And it's our turn. We don't have to do exactly what they did. I can't dance to save my life. That's not going to be my witness. But I have my way, and you have yours. Amen.